Have you ever had your skin shaved off and worn by a creepy robot skeleton? If not, then you've probably never met a flayed one. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video we're looking at some of the most disturbing Necrons of the lot, with a focus review on the flayed ones. Continuing in our Necron series, we're going to take a look at their datasheets, any buffs and synergies that we can give to them on the table, and how I would use them in game. In the background, these twisted Necron terrors are afflicted by an ancient infection that causes them to hunger for organic flesh around them. Striking from the shadows out of their pocket dimension, they often appear to prey on the foes of the Necrons, though rarely in actual coordination with Necron forces themselves, often preceding a Necron force or lying dormant after they've struck. These flesh-maddened horrors strike with extensile limbs, dragging large blades across their foe and decimating enemy infantry formations. Their name comes from their unpleasant practice of daubing themselves in the skins of their victims, and there are few sights more terrifying than a twisted Necron murder machine lurching towards you, wearing the very flesh of your former squad mates. So, all very nice there, let's see what they can do on the tabletop. So here we have the datasheet for flayed ones from the new Codex Necrons. They are an elite's choice for Codex Necrons, and they'll cost you 3 power for 5 of them, or 13 points per model. Their unit size is very flexible indeed. You can have between 5 and 20 of them, so you can really make a big melee Death Star if you really want to, or keep them as a small cheap harassment unit. Their stat line is very similar to the Necron Warrior, with the exception that they have ballistic skill 6+ and 3 attacks rather than 1, with reanimation protocols that are at least reasonably durable, though they are a little bit slow once they get on the board, with only having a movement of 5. Flayed ones have no ranged weapons whatsoever, but their melee attacks are fairly potent against infantry, as you'd expect. They are armed with Flare Claws, which are Strength 4, AP -1 and Damage 1. Unfortunately, they did lose the reroll wound rolls that they had in the previous codex, but they gained a rule called Flesh Hunger, meaning that they get extra hits on 6s if they're targeting a unit that isn't a vehicle. In terms of combat, this will make them fairly decent against all infantry models, though without any additional buffs they are far stronger against light infantry. A squad of 10 flayed ones on the charge will expect to deal around about 14 wounds to guardsmen, about 6 wounds to intercessors, or about 4 wounds to Gravis armoured space marines. Fortunately though, there are a few decent ways to augment their melee. Aside from their flesh hunger, they also have reanimation and command protocols. Reanimation protocols could make them pretty annoying to shift, and it could be particularly useful for an assault unit like flayed ones, because when you reanimate, you could set up the model at the very front of the unit, and therefore gain a little bit of distance towards the enemies that you want to flay. Due to the way that reanimation protocols works, you could do this multiple times per turn potentially, giving your opponent the very scary prospect of an enemy that gets closer to you the more that they shoot them. As for command protocols, the Hungry Void is the one that you really want to be in, particularly if you're Novok, because then you get both benefits. Typically the best option is going to be +1 strength on the charge, giving them strength 5, which will really amp up their efficiency against anything toughness 4 or toughness 5. If you are Novok though, then the extra AP on 6s really isn't a bad thing either. They have the Dimensional Translocation special rule, which means they get a nice standard deep strike 9 inches away from enemies, though really I think that this is only a very good tactic if you have +1 to charge or something like that. Otherwise, a 9-inch charge just really isn't all that reliable. Finally, they actually have a fairly powerful leadership debuff called Terrifying Foes. When an enemy is within 3 inches of flayed ones, then you subtract 2 from the leadership characteristic of models in that unit. -2 leadership is actually really quite meaningful, particularly seeing as they want to be tangling with infantry. It means even if you kill something like 3 Space Marines in a unit, then you'll actually have more of them run away on a 4+, which is fairly powerful. Generally not something I'd plan around too hard, but something that could cause your opponents extra problems or force them to burn command points auto-passing morale. Finally, in terms of keywords, they are infantry, but unfortunately flayed ones are not core. I guess they've been just considered a bit too mad to command by any conventional means, but it does limit their synergy on the battlefield a bit. You're not going to be able to do things like My Will Be Done, and it's a bit annoying for certain warlord traits like the one that allows them to reroll charges. You can't use that one on flayed ones. Despite this though, there are really quite a few synergies that they still have with characters. Overall, flayed ones are a durable and quite scary anti-light infantry melee unit that with the right buffs can be very scary to medium and heavy infantry as well. So let's talk a little bit more about how to get more out of them in game. First of all, you have the choice of dynastic code, of which I have to say Novok is truly outstanding for them. The Novok dynasty basically feels like it was made for these guys. First of all, we have +1 to charge, so an 8-inch charge out of deep strike, and it means that you're actually odds on to make the charge if you make sure that you're sparing a command reroll if they fail. +1 to charge means more successful combats and happier flayed ones. Furthermore, in the first round of combat, if they made a charge or were charged or heroically intervened, you get an extra AP -1 to their melee attacks, which is really meaningful as the AP is quite low. It makes them far more efficient against things like Space Marines. Novok's stratagem allows them to get +1 attack as well should they want it, so you could have 4 attack Flayed ones on the go. And if you combine all of that with the Hungry Void, then a unit of 10 Flayed ones would have 40 attacks at strength 5 with AP -2 and AP -3 on 6s. With that little buff stack in the unique doctrine, rather than killing an average of 3 intercessors, you'll be killing an average of 7 or 8. And of course that could get even scarier if you're bringing a full unit of 20 of the things. Generally, Flayed ones just really like to be Novok. Other potentially helpful normal dynasties are Nihilak for the Obsec or Nefrek for the 6+ Invul. Though honestly, if you were going either of these primarily for Flayed ones, you might consider the custom dynasties, where you get your choice of the 3 bonuses Obsec, 6+ Invul or +1 to charge. Any of those are great, and you can also combine that with the one that gives you a 6-inch pre-game move, or an interesting melee buff one that allows you to auto-wound infantry and bikes on hit rolls of 6. Quite a lot of good combos there, in particular Flayed ones with a pre-game move and Obsec could be really annoying for your opponent to shift. Take a few decent sized units of these, and you could have a very scary amount of bladed Necron warriors hanging out on objectives with Obsec. We mentioned command protocols. The Hungry Void is of course great, though Sudden Storm could be useful in the first turn or two if you're starting on the board. An extra inch of movement doesn't hurt. In terms of character buffs, of course a fair few are locked out due to them not being core, but one of the best ones for Flayed ones in my opinion is the Chronomancer. His buff doesn't have to target core units, it can be anything, and again it's pretty much made for Flayed ones. They get great benefits out of both halves of it. His Chronomancer buff will give you a 5+ Invul save and also re-rolling charges. The only downside to the Chronomancer is that you have to deploy that buff in the command phase, so you can't use it on a unit that's coming out of Deep Strike. It's generally better for a unit that's starting on the board. Another interesting option could be the Psychomancer to double down on the leadership debuff. He could use a power that gives the enemy another -1 to leadership and also -1 to combat attrition, which would lead them to be odds on to lose quite a lot of models to morale, even if the Flayed ones only make a small impact. Resurrection Orbs and the Orb of Eternity could be great on a really big 20-man Flayed one unit, particularly if they're buffed up by Chronometron to give them a 5+ Invul. They'll be really tricky to remove, and it could be pretty horrible for your opponent to have a good amount of Flayed ones just stand right back up and charge into melee. If you can somehow keep a Reanimator alive, then that could help reanimation protocols as well, and one interesting option for giving command protocols could be a Hexmark Destroyer, as he's got an innate Deep Strike ability, and could potentially think about jumping in alongside the Flayed ones to give them that Hungry Void protocol. His firepower isn't great admittedly, but he is fairly cheap. In terms of stratagems, there are 3 fairly good ones that Flayed ones can use. First of all is the excellent Storm of Flensing Blades, which is a nice clean and simple fight again mechanic. This has the potential to be one of the best value stratagems in the Necron Codex in the right circumstances, and obviously you're going to get more out of it the more Flayed ones that you have in the unit. In Theory Land, if you're playing Novok and also use their stratagem on a full unit of 20, then you have the potential for up to 160 attacks out of them. Naturally that's going to go through pretty much any infantry, and if you manage to be in the Hungry Void protocol as well, you're pretty much going to go through any vehicle as well. Obviously that is assuming a non-depleted squad, but it really is a couple of command points that can turn a Flayed one unit from an anti-light infantry unit to something that will kill near anything in the game. Very, very nasty indeed. Next we have Shadows of Drazak, which is a -1 to hit, and it's a good reactive one as well. You only have to use it when your unit is actually targeted, and you could use it either in melee or at range. So if you desperately need your Flayed ones to survive a turn, then you can pop this stratagem and make them a real problem unit to remove from the table. Finally, I would just always remember to save a command point reroll for that charge out of Deep Strike. An 8-inch charge rerollable out of Deep Strike has something like a 70% chance to succeed, and it's likely to make the difference between you getting a lot of damage or not getting it. So how would I think about using Flayed ones in game? First of all, I think in the right build, both starting them on the board and aiming to Deep Strike are both perfectly viable. Generally, I typically want to have an idea before the game as to whether or not I was going one way or the other, and typically if I was thinking about Deep Strike, I'd want the +1 to charge, either with Novok or with a Custom Dynasty. If you're playing Custom Dynasties and have an innate pre-game move and objective secured, then starting on the board might be far better. You're already going to have your Flayed ones right into the midfield right from turn 1. If you are going down the Deep Strike route, I really do think that you can use anything from a small unit of Flayed ones to a very big one. Having just a few Flayed ones pop up to harass enemy objective holders could be really annoying, or you could go all in and make them a Death Star kill everything type unit by having them pop up and fight again and pulverize a couple of enemy infantry squads. If the squad's small enough, I would typically aim to pop them up in cover. That way at least you're a little bit more durable if the charge does fail. and I'd most certainly like to have a command point reroll available if you don't make the first roll. If they have a choice of targets, they're likely going to want to go after infantry first, and if you don't manage to kill everyone, I'd certainly try and aim to try-point some enemy infantry so they can't fall back, or they have to use that expensive desperate breakout stratagem. Pre-game, you could think about organising to arrive at the same time as the Hungry Void protocol is enacted, so make sure that one's either turn 2 or turn 3. Strength 5 really does do a lot from these guys, and it's one of the command protocols that's really meaningful. When you've connected, it's quite nice to have the opportunity to decide whether you want to fight twice, and see if those 2 command points could be worth it for finishing off the enemy unit, or maybe even just getting the extra movement, to get closer to the enemy and maybe get onto objectives. If you're starting on the table, then I'd certainly consider a bigger unit of Flayed ones, anything up to 20, and I'd strongly consider having some decent character support with them, particularly a Chronomancer would be my first pick. A Lord or Overlord with a Resurrection Orb to hang around as well would be pretty solid. Ideally they want to be starting fairly far forward, somewhere that they can't be ignored or kited, and if you have the opportunity to, start far forward in the deployment zone, out of line of sight or in light cover. Then they can scrabble their way towards midfield objectives and fight off any enemies that presume to take them from you. Overall, I think that Flayed ones are a decent enough unit in Codex Necrons, though they really come into their own if you are playing Novok. Interestingly, with the new Codex, Necrons have absolutely tons of decent melee options now, so the space that they're fighting for is a bit crowded. For melee starting on the board, you could think about Scorpec Destroyers, which will handle heavy infantry and tanks very easily, or maybe Necron Wraiths, which still have moderate damage output but are quite fast. If you're going down the pre-game move and objective secured on everything route, Scarabs might do you a bit better. Again, they're faster, and they're really hard to shift point for points just because they have so many wounds per base. In the Deep Strike department, you could weigh them up against Ophidian Destroyers. They're a bit easier to kill than the Flayed ones are, but their melee is significantly better. Or you could think about using a unit of Lich Guard and the Veil of Darkness to jump them across the board, where they'll just be a horrible anti-everything melee unit, and potentially a fair bit harder to put down with Flayed ones, particularly if you give them the shields. So certainly a very decent amount of options vying for the melee spot in the Necron army. I do think Flayed ones have their place though. Compared with these alternatives, they're pretty much the best against light infantry. They can fight twice, make great use of the Novok dynasty, and great use of reanimation protocols as well. So let me know your thoughts about these horrible flensing abominations down in the comments below. I'm certainly looking forward to seeing their kit when it comes out. I think that Necron players will be very grateful to get a kit that isn't made in resin. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to the channel. We'll certainly be keeping the Necron content coming over the next few weeks, and feel free to let me know what sort of things you'd like to see next down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the channel and you'd like to help support, I'd just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page, which you can find down in the video description. Making all of these videos does take quite a bit of time that I wouldn't be able to dedicate to it without the generous support of you guys. If you would be interested in helping out, I do try and give some decent rewards to channel Patreons, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and entry to the channel's regular prize draw, with the chance to win some big kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.